Thing he shows no sign of giving up, his Twitter feed, which Trump used last night to chum up the waters of international intrigue. First, he called the Chinese seizure of an American underwater drone in international waters unprecedented, fixed to unprecedented later in the day. In negotiations with the U.S. government, the Chinese then agreed to return the device, which Trump's spokesman curiously took credit for. But then the president-elect tweeted, quote, "We should tell China that we don't want the drone they stole back. Let them keep it." Joining me live to discuss this and much else is Arizona Republican Senator John McCain. He's chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Good morning, Senator. Good to see you.
Good morning, Jake.
So let me ask you about this tweet. What do you make of President-elect Trump reacting like this? More to the point, what does it mean to tell the Chinese to keep the drone? Is there a strategy behind that?
I don't know. I know that the Chinese are able to do a thing called reverse engineering, where they're able to, while they hold this drone, able to find out all of the technical information, and some of it is pretty valuable. But the fundamental here is that the Chinese have taken an American vehicle and in international waters in a gross violation of international law. Maybe they saw the success that the Iranians had after they captured 2 American vessels and put American sailors on their knees, and then when they were returned, the Secretary of State thanked them for that. Look, there's no strength on the part of the United States of America. Everybody's taking advantage of it, and hopefully that will change soon. But it's almost unheard of, Jake, for American vehicles and ships in international waters being taken by another Iranian, or in this case, Chinese ship, in gross violation of international law. They're flaunting it.
Let's turn to Russia. President Obama on Friday defended his response to the Russia hack during a press conference. Take a listen.
In early September, when I saw President Putin in China, I felt that the most effective way to ensure that that didn't happen was to talk to him directly and tell him to cut it out, and there were going to be some serious consequences if he didn't.
What do you think of the president's response, and how do you think the U.S. needs to respond going forward?
Well, the president's response was sort of an acknowledgement and an endorsement of what they've already done. The president has no strategy and no policy as to what to do about these various cyber attacks that have possibly disrupted an American election. We need a select committee. We need to get to the bottom of this. We need to find out exactly what was done and what the implications of the attacks were, especially if they had an effect on our election. There's no doubt they were interfering, and no doubt it was a cyber attacks. The question now is how much and what damage, and what should the United States of America do? And so far, we've been totally paralyzed. I'm sure that when Vladimir Putin was told, "cut it out," unquote, I'm sure that Vladimir Putin immediately stopped all cyber activity. The fact is, they are hacking every single day in other areas of our military and all kinds of different aspects of American life that they're able to penetrate. And we have no strategy, nor do we have any policy towards that, and it's very disturbing.
But just to underline what you said, you're calling for a select committee, joint House and Senate, to investigate what exactly happened with the Russian hack. Let me ask you, you're being critical of President Obama's posture towards Russia, but President-elect Trump seems to have a friendly posture towards Russia, one that must upset you, given the fact that you've long been suspicious of Vladimir Putin. When President-elect Trump called you to discuss the nomination of General Mattis for Secretary of Defense, which will obviously go through your committee, did you raise your concerns about Russia to him?
No, because it was a brief conversation, and he mentioned that he was that General Mattis was going to be his nominee. There was not a conversation. But look, Jake, what's happening here? when we see the seizure of these ships, when we see the cyber attacks, when we see the dismemberment of Syria, when we see the tragedies that are taking place there, which are heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking, while we sat by and watched all this happen, this is the sign of a possible unraveling of the world order that was established after World War II, which has made one of the most peaceful periods in the history of the world. We're starting to see that the strains and the unraveling of it, and that is because of an absolute failure of American leadership. When America doesn't lead, a lot of other bad people do, and that's why we're seeing this slaughter in Aleppo that breaks your heart.
I understand that you're critical of President Obama on this issue, but are you not even more concerned about the fact that President-elect Trump seems to want to be friends with Vladimir Putin? I haven't heard him ever criticize Putin, ever. Have you?
No, I have not heard him criticize Putin. I think reality is going to intercede at one point or another just because of the Russian activities. And I hope that with people like General Mattis and some other people around him, that he will very quickly understand what the Russians are all about. And that is, they are ahead of us in many respects in this whole issue of cyber warfare. So we not only need a select committee on exactly what they did in this case, but the whole issue of cyber warfare, where we have no strategy and no policy, because it is one of the areas where they have an advantage, perhaps the only area where our adversaries have an advantage over us.
Hillary Clinton spoke to her donors on Thursday night in New York City. She sought to explain the election's outcome. She pointed the finger at Putin. Take a listen.
Vladimir Putin himself directed the covert cyber attacks against our electoral system, against our democracy, apparently because he has a personal beef against me.
I've heard some commentators criticize Clinton for saying that Putin directed cyber attacks against, quote, the electoral system, suggesting that she's misleading voters about what happened, that it sounds like she's saying the voting machines themselves were attacked. Do you agree with that criticism? And what do you make of her overall argument?
I have seen no evidence that the voting machines were tampered with. I haven't seen no evidence that the election would have been different, but that doesn't change the fact that the Russians and others, Chinese to a lesser degree, have been able to interfere with our electoral process. How serious it is and whether it would have affected the outcome of the election or not is the reason why we need to have a select committee. Jake, the responsibilities for cyber is spread over about 4 different committees in the Senate, and each doing their own thing, frankly, is not going to be the most efficient way of arriving at a conclusion. This is serious business. If they're able to harm the electoral process, then they destroy democracy, which is based on free and fair elections.
Just before you go, sir, if a Democrat were in the same position as Donald Trump right now, had the Democrat had been helped, arguably, by the Russians interfering, if the Democrat had never criticized Vladimir Putin, if a Democrat had appointed somebody to be his Secretary of State who had received a Friendship of Russia award, don't you think you'd be much more critical of that president-elect than you're being of Donald Trump?
Well, I think I've been quite concerned about the nominee for the Secretary of State. I would have been much more, as I say, I am heartbroken over what's happened in Aleppo, the genocide that's taken place there, one of the greatest in the 20th century. I have been, no matter who would have been president when that happened, I would have been just as critical, just as I was critical of the failures of the George W. Bush administration. I was critical of the Reagan administration when they put the Marines in Beirut. So I think I have a pretty clear record of not being partisan in my criticisms, and I believe that right now when you look at America's position in the world, we're in very serious jeopardy, and America is still the greatest nation in the world, but we have a lot of work to do to restore our position in the world and defend this nation. And we need a select committee on cyber, and we need to do a lot of other things like sail the international waters without fear of being impeded by Chinese activities.
All right, Senator John McCain, thank you so much. Good to see you. Merry Christmas to you and your family, sir.
Thank you, Jake.